Hello and welcome to the Crimson Stitchery, a video channel about making all things that are beautiful and useful. My name is Anushka and you can find me elsewhere online as Asawatelling, that's Asawatelling, and that's my username on Instagram where I have my personal account, and on Ravelry. And on Ravelry we also have a Ravelry group where we have knit-alongs, discussions, and people give recommendations and advice, so do go along and join our Ravelry group if that's something that you're interested in. The links for anything that I mention are just in the down bar here on YouTube, as they are with all videos that I make. So I release a video normally every Tuesday. This is my fortnightly craft podcast, and I intersperse my longer podcast videos with short videos, vlogs, tutorials, etc, and the like. So in this fortnight's podcast episode, I have got quite a few projects that I've been working on to share with you guys, and I'll also be sharing a recent collaboration that I did with a textile artist who works in weave, where we worked together on some poetry. So I'm really looking forward to sharing that project with you today. Just a quick announcement before I get into what I've been working on, which is that the August edition of my monthly newsletter, Postcards from the Crimson Stitchery, is going to go out on the 2nd of August. So if you haven't already signed up for my newsletter, do click on the link below here and sign up for my mailing list. I promise I will never spam you, and it will hopefully always be interesting and varied and aesthetically pleasing content. Thanks so much to everybody who's already given me absolutely lovely feedback about the 1st July edition of my newsletter. So I've got my cup of cold tea as usual, because I always brew it and then by the time I get round to setting up the camera and everything, it's gone completely cold. And without further ado, let's get stuck in. So, knitting basket. Haven't been doing very much knitting. It's been really bizarre weather in the UK and across Northern Europe, where we've had like blisteringly, swelteringly hot days interspersed with really gloomy, rainy and grey, muggy days, which is what it is today, unfortunately. So it's like hot, muggy. It's not very inspiring. So yeah, I haven't done tons, but what I did do was I realised that I had made a start on this black top. It doesn't look like very much here, but it's just going to be a black vest top knit out of bamboo cotton, and it's going to have a plain black front, and the back I've decided to do in an open kind of hopefully geometric lace pattern, but I need to choose that first. So it's kind of loosely based on a pattern by Kim Hargreaves, and I was hoping to enter into the Kim Hargreaves along, a make-along endeavour that's being hosted by Stitching Over the Days podcast. But I cast it on about a month or two ago, quite a while ago, and just completely forgot about it, because you see it's black, so you have to really work on it in daylight and in quite particular circumstances. So I've once I got going on it, I just zipped up it really quickly. It's just one of those things that I need to just commit to doing it. And I've got to the armpits. And it's going to be quite form-fitting, but it's knit out of bamboo cotton, and my experience of this bamboo cotton yarn is that it will grow quite visibly and rapidly once just on the body, with, you know, the warmth of the body heat, a little bit of moisture, and it will just grow down there. So not very much to look at, but I have been working on that. Haven't been working on any of my jumper projects. But the other thing I've been working on is this pair of socks here, and I've got a half object, or half finished object, or one sock out of the pair. So here is my sock. It's knit from a tweedy hand-dyed Blueface Leicester yarn, and ouch, and because the yarn is 100% Blueface Leicester with no synthetic content, I decided to go down a needle size and up a stitch count in order to create a more dense fabric. But for me, down a needle size to my 2.25mm higher sharps, I hardly use these, so they're really sharp, and I think I just actually and can you see this puncture mark? Just now that was the needle just popping into the side of my hand. Great. Yeah, so I hardly use these ones, so they've not been dulled or blunted in any way at all, so they're really sharp. And I've knit on higher sharps a lot, and I knit nearly all of my socks on my usual sock size, which is 2.5mm needles, but I've only used the 2.25 a few times, and these are deadly. I actually just cut my hand on them last week. I've got a scar there where I picked up my knitting bag and the knitting needle had poked out and it just ran itself along the side of my hand. So that's once a week scarring. My goodness, these socks better be worth it. So yeah, bit of a digression. I had this Blue Face Leicester yarn that didn't contain any nylon or any other kind of strengthening agent, if you will, fibre. So I wanted to knit it at a tighter gauge. But I was really concerned about the points that get the most wear on the sock, which are the heel and the toe, where it kind of rubs against your foot at the either end against the shoe, really. So I did have another ball of similar colour kind of yarn, coral. These are two hand-dyed yarns. This one here is stranded dye wax and this one here is spectrum fibres. And they're both Blue Face Leicester, but this one, the stranded one, does contain nylon. And it's in comparable colours, but quite a different effect on the dye, because the stranded one definitely gave a much more mild effect, whereas the one I'm using now is much more speckledy, and with the tweed it's this crazy texture. So I filled in with the toe and the heel using the stranded, which is BFL containing nylon, Blue Face Leicester and nylon sock yarn. So it's the kind of thing where you notice it if you squint and if you know what to look for, but I'm confident that when you stand back and glimpse the sock, you don't really notice it. And anyway, these parts are always going to be covered up once they're inside a shoe. So this sock is not for me, it's actually a gift, so I'm not going to say too much more about that in case the recipient is watching. So yeah, that's it really. Just been working on this sock because I've got loads and loads of WIPs work in progress projects at the moment, but they're all getting quite big and I just needed something small and portable that I could just take out and do. And also it's a vanilla sock, it's just a plain stockinette sock. I don't have to think about it at all. My partner did actually comment. He was like, oh, it's taking you a lot longer to knit that pair of socks than it normally takes you. And just something about having gone up only 4 stitches is more of a mental block than anything, probably. It's just taking me so much longer. I'm just knitting one size up. But you know, also there's the heat and the fact that I've barely been knitting at all, to be honest with you. So yeah, I'll probably get that done quite soon, and then there's going to be quite a lot left over, so I will be making another pair of coral socks in a smaller size. So this is bigger than my normal size, and I'll do a smaller than my normal size, which will be a present for one of my best friends who's got tiny feet and who has been begging me for years to knit her a pair of socks. And she was like, oh, I'll pay you. And I said, no, you can't pay me, because the amount of money that you give me to hand knit a sock will never amount to anything comparable to a wage. I'll just make one for you and give them to you. And she was like, oh no, it's too much time. You can't do that, it's too much to ask. So I said, okay, well, you buy me the yarn. And then years have gone by. I briefed her very carefully on what yarn she'd need to get. She's never gone and got it, never. So a couple of years have gone by at this point, and she keeps asking about these socks, and I'm like, well, where's the yarn? Where's the yarn? And she's quite fussy about the colour as well. You know, she wants either cream or pink. It has to be pretty. So in the end, I just showed her this, and I said, look, I'm going to have loads left over of this, and I bought it for someone else, so if you'd like, you can have that. And she was like, yes, please. So yeah, I'll be pushing out another pair of socks out of the leftovers of this at some point soon. So that's in my future. While we're on the subject of WIPs, normally in this section of my podcast, the Crimson Stitchery, I call it knitting basket, because I've got a basket here And normally all of my WIPs are just sitting in here in the corner of my living room, ready to grab for recording and whatnot. But the last few episodes, the knitting basket has been in the naughty corner, quite literally, because it is so full up of nonsense. It's just full up of nonsense. Look, stuff is just falling out of it as I speak. There's just too much stuff. The WIPs are getting out of hand. And I was thinking about this in the shower, where I do all of my best work, and I thought, oh, I think that I need to have a WIP-along. I think I need to do a works in progress WIP-along, and I'd love to do it in some company. So there's currently still a knit-along going on with the Crimson Stitchery. It's the vintage Shetland spring cowl. But obviously with the heatwave that we've had, I finished my project quite early, but I, as far as I'm aware, no one else has who was taking part in the knit-along, and I don't really blame people for putting it on hiatus over the summer. And also, I was thinking that maybe I'd like to knit a second project from the Vintage Shetland spring cows. So originally the Vintage Shetland spring cowl ran from spring in the Northern Hemisphere till September, spring in the Southern Hemisphere, but I'm thinking maybe we'll just extend it and maybe just do it like a 10-month cowl or even a 12-month cowl. So if you were taking part in that, please do leave me a comment and let me know what you think about extending the Vintage Shetland spring cowl and maybe working on some projects over the winter too. As part of that cowl, WIPs were allowed and encouraged, and I'm thinking of maybe running a knit along from maybe from the next podcast episode, so mid-August, all the way up until the 1st of January, where we make a list of all of the WIPs that we can find, just like go into every corner and every drawer and bring them out, write them down on a list, and then just decide that we're going to try and finish at least one. So I think that that's something that I definitely need to do, and I would really like some company and some encouragement. So if doing a WIP-along is something that you're interested in, please let me know. We'd probably do it here on YouTube, over on Ravelry, and if you guys want to join in on Instagram, that's totally fine. But as discussed in my last episode, I am not currently using Instagram to document knitting. I might do again in the future, but do watch the last fortnight's podcast episode in order to hear my thoughts on that. I'm not going to go into it now, aside to say thank you very much for everybody for your messages of support and your comments. I really appreciate it, and it's quite nice to know that you're not alone, I think. Let's leave it at that. So yeah, Vintage Shetland spring cowl, shall we keep going on it, and WIP-along, will you join me? Okay, so moving across into sewing. I did do some sewing. I now can't find the sewing that I've doing. Ah, okay. So it's really hot and I didn't want to wear clothes. So what I decided to do was to make a pair of boxer shorts for myself so that I could just wear them around the house and in bed. And boxer shorts, or what I call lady boxers, are quite good to wear under quite big full skirted and flowy dresses, because then when you have that situation where there's suddenly a gust of wind, or you're on the street and the car drives past really fast and your skirt starts flapping, you don't get too exposed because you're basically wearing a cute pair of shorts underneath your skirt, and it's not too tight and it's quite cooling as well. So I had a pair of French knickers that were falling apart in a really embarrassing way, like the elastic was disintegrating, and I didn't quite realise for a while, and I kept wearing them, and the less said about that situation the better. So I finally took them out of circulation, gave them a wash and cut them apart and used them as a pattern, and I made this pair of boxer shorts. Now if you're thinking that they are quite wide, just hang on. So I just went into my fabric storage, my fabric stash, and just pulled out this really cute fabric. Now what do you think it is? Because I originally thought that it was lemons, but it's also got red dots in the background, and also the lemons have got little eyes, so I thought maybe they were giant olives, but I've got no idea. If you've got any ideas, let me know. So I pulled the fabric out of my stash, whipped them up really quickly, did French seaming, did this bias binding trim. You'll notice that on the back of the shorts, the bias binding, is coming out in 2 different colours. And that's simply because I ran out of this forest green. I had almost enough, had enough to do 1.5 legs, and I didn't want to go out and buy it anymore, so I just put in a little piece in this dark grey, which also coordinates quite nicely, and I really don't think that it's something that you notice if you weren't looking out for it. So there was just no reason to go out, and it's not just spend the money, you know, it would only have been 50p or something like that, but it's more just to use what I have for the sake of it, you know, just to use it up, because that short length of bias, I guess it could even have been put in the bin, because what else would I have used it for? So it's quite nice to use it up. Now, I made these. The fabric is a very old quilting cotton from the 1980s that I acquired when a family relative was cleaning out their cupboards. I've mentioned before that this happens to me quite a lot, probably too much. And I've actually tried to put a stop on it these days. But anyway, got hold of this, and it's a very, very lightweight and finely woven cotton lawn. So it's an absolutely lovely fabric to be wearing in the heat wave. And I loved wearing them. And similarly to the bias binding, the elastic in the waistband casing was just something that I had lying around. Didn't quite have enough, so I joined 2 strips of elastic. And I wore them and I wore them and I wore them. And it was so hot, and it was 39 degrees. And I wore them to take out the recycling, and just as I was bending over to drop the recycling into the bin, the elastic just popped. Ah! So I just had to like grab them and run in the house because I could feel them falling down. So that was really annoying. So I've made these shorts, and they were just like a little elastic waist, so they just gathered in at the waist like so. And they've already gone straight onto my mending pile. So irritating. So I'm now going to have to go and buy a reel of elastic. Elastic is something that I buy in bulk. I buy it in really large coils, which has got advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantage being that if you leave it for too long in your stash, the rubber will degrade. So you have to be careful, like don't put it in direct sunlight. But the advantage is it's so much cheaper. So much cheaper. So yeah, that's what I do. So I'll go to the wholesalers in central London and pick up a reel of elastic, and this can just go in my mending pile. Now onto mending stories. At long last, I've been promising ever since I started this podcast, at long last I got the bug for mending, and one morning I just was in the mood for sewing, so I whipped up those shorts, and then I actually tackled some of my mending pile. I know, can you believe it? Does it look like I've made a dent in my mending pile? No, it does not. I've still got absolutely tons of mending to do. But I've got this stack of clothing to show you. So first off, I popped some buttons on. So I have this lovely silk blouse. I've actually got 2 of these silk blouses. And I popped a new button on the cuff as the old one had fallen off. And while I was doing that, I filmed my button tutorial, my button sewing tutorial, which I promised you guys a few episodes ago. So hopefully that should be coming out next week with any luck. So look out for that. While we're on the subject of buttons, I've also got these trousers that you've seen before, and the button on the back had come off and on the front fly, so I just popped those back on. And these are a different type of button from the cuff button because they're a shank button, they don't have any holes. So in my button tutorial I do cover sewing on 3 different types of button with comparable, you know, related but distinct techniques, so look out for that. I have got this dress, which I didn't make, but the gathered skirt that goes into the bodice, it had just come loose for some reason, and so there was like a hole poking out at my waist. So that was really easy, just flipped it into the wrong side and put a line of stitching there in my sewing machine. So that's 3. 4, this blue dress, again a vintage one, not one that I'd made. The capped sleeves were coming out of the armpit, so I just pulled it back underneath and top stitched it down. So this was just poking out because it had come unstitched, so I just put it back in and stitched it down with the sewing machine. And then lastly, this pair of black trousers, which is it's a pair that I bought secondhand off a colleague, ex-colleague, who was clearing out, and they're just from the high street, they're just from a high street chain, and I've been wearing them for years. I've had them for about 7 years at this point, and they've held up really well, and they just still fit. The fabric hasn't shredded out in any way. They're a bit crumpled now, but once I iron them up, or even just wear them, the creases do fall out really easily. If they ever do start to wear out, I'm definitely going to be unpicking them and using them as a pattern because they've been so good. And all that I needed to do with these was just put up the hem of the trousers again because they had got caught on probably my bicycle spoke and just come down. So I did that using a herringbone stitch. It's kind of like a zigzag, and it's a way of putting up fabric so that it's really flat. So here the edge was overlocked, it wasn't turned over as a rolled hem in any way because this fabric is quite thin and drapey to avoid bulk. So it's just folded over the top and then used herringbone stitch to put the hem up. And that's become one of my favourite hand sewing stitches. I learnt it when I was in school for tailoring and used it all the time when I worked as a professional costume maker. And has some real world applications too. So that's my mending pile. I've still got loads of mending to do. It's so annoying. It's like just the tip of the iceberg, as it were. And the things that I didn't do had all got something to do with patching. And I just didn't want to get into that. So I did lots of small jobs, and I'm quite happy about that. It's been great to put lots of these clothing back into circulation in my regular wardrobe. So that's it, back on the mending spree, and hopefully I'll continue in that vein as I was quite good in the spring. So that's it for the things that I've been working on by hand, as it were. But for conversational threads, I want to share with you a project that I did about a month or 6 weeks ago now, a collaborative poetry project. This is something that I did with the textile artist Yu Yang, or Yang Yu, who's from China and who did actually feature in the vlog video that I made of the Royal College of Art Textiles grad show. He's the guy that pops up next to this beautiful, beautiful tapestry and starts kind of dancing like a piece of seaweed. So that's Yu. And a little while ago, he got in touch with me asking if I could help him work on some poetry. So basically he's an artist that works in weave, and he had created his final, graduate collection pieces based on memory, nostalgia and his childhood. It was all about sort of the differences of growing up in China as it was beginning to industrialize in the 80s, and then moving away, working in different countries, and now finally working in England and sort of thinking back to how things have changed now. And as he had created his sketchbooks, he had written some poetry to go along with photographs and finished pieces that he had been making alongside this collection. And the poems were all in Chinese because that's his mother tongue. So he got in touch with me asking if I could help him reinterpret the poems in English. So I said to him, look, I'm not a translator. I don't know, how could I help you, do you think? However, I am, I've written poetry and song and creative writing and so on quite a lot in the past, but I'm not a translator. And he said, oh no, I'm not looking for a translation. So what he'd done was he had used Google Translate to do a direct translation of his words in Chinese, and then he just handed me this direct translation, and he's just basically said, here you go, please make it beautiful. So it was a really interesting task, and what it basically required me to do was try to figure out the essence of each poem. And it was 11 poems, like it was quite a big job. There was quite a lot. So he basically gave me a Word document with like the direct translation and then the image that had somehow inspired the words. So sometimes it was a painting and sometimes it was a photograph that he'd taken. His crones on top of a new build block of flats. And what I had to do was read the direct translation, and then I just spent ages gazing at the image that was offered next to the words. And I just had to kind of do my best to get into his mindset. And I'd said to him, like, are there rhymes? Is there rhythm in the Chinese? Kind of how does it work? And he sent me a couple of poems by some romantic Chinese poets. And he said, oh, this is the kind of feeling that I want. So I just had to really, really use my imagination and try and imagine that I was in his headspace when he took the photo and made the art, and just imagine how he connected through it and the messages that he was trying to give. Like literally I was emailed this document and I had one phone conversation. I didn't have time to sit down and discuss with him what every single one meant before I reinterpreted it in poetic English, but he just kept saying to me, oh, I trust you, just make it really beautiful and quite romantic, and it will be great. And I was like, oh, okay, it feels like a lot of responsibility. So I did it. I interpreted the 11 poems. I'm not really sure how to describe it because it's not a translation. So let's say I reinterpreted the poems into English and presented them to him, and he absolutely loved them, and he printed them in this paper catalogue. Now, very annoyingly, he only printed 2 copies, which is such a shame because it's a really beautiful publication. It's a lovely book. He's got such a great sense of space and the layout, you know, using the white space and everything. It's totally gorgeous, and it's got like various different ones of his weavings interspersed with photographs and my poetry. And then at the back he put all of the Chinese text, which I personally thought was a shame. I quite like it when you have side-by-side translations so that you can compare them or just see how they're laid out on the page differently, because so much about poetry is about the kind of shape and feeling of words and the way that we can look at something 2D that can conjure up a 3D, you know, sensory response with sound, with sights in different ways. So I feel like the shape of the poem on the page definitely influences how I read it in terms of the rhythm and the meter and the beat, if you like. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read a couple of the poems that I reinterpreted for you. And I'll start with the first one, which is about the process of weaving. And it starts with this photograph of all of these heddles here. So it goes, I long to sit in quiet by the loom, pulling yarns through one by one, fingers tug the heddle. Not in silence, the threads rustle a merry song, I speak my sorrows. Gently, the loom purrs a reply. Warp plucked, my arms exhausted, it whispers sweet nothings into my unfolding cloth. Hold on, the weft moves. Plans fall through, my pictures form and change. So that's the poem about weaving. So when I read his English direct translation of his Chinese poem, I just got the feeling of sitting down at a huge piece of equipment and being completely engaged with your task. And the way that weaving for me is really transformative, because a loom is so absolutely huge and the craftsperson, the human, is so dominated by the equipment, like you're so small. And it's always quite amazing to me how your hands can just, from like the size that's limited here, your hands will upscale and produce something, you know, bigger than your own arm span. And it's so different from knitting, isn't it? When knitting is so like engaged about the object that's exactly in front of you. Yeah, I'm not a weaver, but I really liked this idea of having these warp threads just stretching out into the future and using the weft threads to create the story. So it's kind of like you literally have a blank canvas of the warp threads and then you're sketching in with the weft, which again is different from knitting, because with knitting you have the, you know, ball of yarn, that's your blank canvas, that's quite self-contained as an object, and you are actively manipulating it into shape in front of you. So yeah, completely different processes of two very different crafts that both use, you know, yarn, fibre, textiles. So that was the poem. I'm going to read you one more. Okay. When I was a kid, I used to drag my grandmother to the market to hunt for used toys. Displaced, their bright colours marked them a stranger in my neighbourhood. Hard or soft, plastic or cloth, they whispered secrets, spoke of stories and life. Out of a pile, my favourite leapt into my chubby hand, eager to join me home. And then that was called Toys, and then here's the weaving that accompanied it by Yang Yu. And this one, I just felt myself in that bustling atmosphere when you're a child and you're so short and you're being like dragged along by hand by the adults and you're kind of looking up and everything's going on in front of you. And I thought about when you go to a market or even a supermarket, when they put the toys at the eye level of the child, which is so bad, and then you just want everything and everything is so shiny and you just kind of want to go out and grab and you're so eager to take something home with you. And a toy is like a transformative object for a child because it's not a lifeless piece of, you know, plastic or material in any way. It's got potential to be transformed into stories, characters, things that you build. In many ways, it's sort of in the same way that we see stuff like this and we imagine what it could be. I think it's like that for toys for kids. So I was just trying to create that bustling and bright and sparkly atmosphere of the market there and the kid being pulled along by his grandma. Maybe I'll read one more. Oh, they're so beautiful. Honestly, I wish that he had printed more. It's silly. It seems really silly. Okay, the last one that I'll read was taken from this photo, which I'm pretty sure is London. Sort of photograph of some rooftops looking out of a window to a neighbouring window. Okay. Smoke billows, laughter peals, bright lights show life within. Looking out of the window, I draw the curtains, envelop myself inside my evening. So I'll leave that there for today, my poetry collaboration with the textile artist Yang Yu, and I'll leave a link to his website below this video. So that's it for this episode. Thank you so much for joining me once again for the Crimson Stitchery. I hope you've enjoyed it. A big thank you again to everybody who has supported this channel over on Ko-fi by buying me a coffee. That's been really fantastic. So if you'd like to leave me a tip for creating this channel, or if you'd like to leave me some financial support, the link for my Ko-fi account is below in the show notes. Thank you so much for watching. Next week, look out for the button tutorial for the Crimson Stitchery, and then let me know your thoughts on the WIP-along. I'd love to hear what you think. Would you like to take part? How do you think we could organise it? Let's do this collaboratively. Leave me a comment and let me know. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up below and hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Thanks for joining me. Happy knitting. Take care.